So our catechism questions for our older kids this week focus on Jesus, specifically in his death, and eventually we're going to get to his resurrection next week. But first we want to rewind to last week. Last week we took a look at Mary and a little bit about Joseph. But the end of question 31 talks about what took place in Bethlehem, and maybe if you didn't flip the page, you missed the page on Christmas. And then there's a whole summary of the Nativity, and then these cool little pictures that summarize all of Jesus' ministry and his earthly life. We don't just want to skip ahead to the end of the story, even though it's kind of the most important part. You don't want to miss out on all of Jesus' life, because he lived several years, 30 years, an ordinary, boring, if you will, human life in a family, just like you and I do too, right? And he had these brilliant moments at his birth when these fancy special things happened, and this special time when he was 12 when his parents lost him and they found him in the temple, right? A couple stories we hear about his life, and then nothing until his public ministry starts when he's 30 years old. And at the end of his 3-year ministry, that's when we get to these catechism questions for this week. That Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. And the key takeaway for all this stuff is going to talk about what crimes Jesus was committed of, and did he actually die, was he actually buried, and all that fun stuff. The real thing is all this stuff that Jesus did, right? He went through that agony in the garden of real fear about what was going to physically happen to him, right? He wanted to redeem us on the one hand, but on the other hand, he's human like us, and he doesn't want to go through this pain and suffering if he doesn't have to. So he feels that conflicted feeling, right? He goes through the trial. It's a completely unjust trial. He's being accused of things that he didn't do, and he's just taking that on. I'm sure you've been accused of things you haven't done before. He goes through all the physical suffering of being scourged and crowned with thorns and carrying a cross through a crowded city, up a hill, to be nailed to it, to die. And then he's buried in a tomb. Don't worry, the story's going to continue next week. Why does he do all that stuff? He doesn't do it just to take away sins in a vague way. He does it to take away your sins and my sins. That's the important thing to remember about this part of the story that you've heard dozens and dozens and dozens of times, is that it's personal. Jesus did it for you, and he did it for me, and he'd do it again if he had to.